When we say that ancient Athens was the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and Western civilization, we are describing the experience of perhaps 10 to 15% of its population. The rest, the enslaved, the women, foreign residents, the poor citizens working from before dawn, were the foundation on which that celebrated culture rested, and they have been largely invisible in the story we have told about it. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hotsteel.
Good evening, Clara.
The popular image of ancient Greece is one of marble temples, philosophical dialogues, and democratic assemblies under a bright sky. This image is real, but it describes the experience of a minority in a society built on the labor and constraint of the majority. Tonight we turn to the daily life of classical Athens as it was actually lived, across the full range of social positions, and ask what the city looked like from the ground rather than from the heights of its most celebrated achievements. The question is not only how different their world was from ours, but how familiar the patterns of inequality, labor dependency, and limited agency that structured their daily lives remain when we look closely at our own.
Athens, in the 5th century, before the Common Era, had a population of perhaps 300,000 people in its territory of Attica. Of these, only adult male citizens, perhaps 30 to 40,000, held political rights. The rest, perhaps 100,000 enslaved people, 40,000 foreign residents known as metics, and the entire female citizen population lived outside the political system entirely. The democracy we celebrate was a democracy of the few.
We are speaking about daily life in classical Athens, the world behind the philosophy, the art, and the political innovation as experienced by the full range of people who inhabited it.
The city that produced Socrates, Thucydides, and the Parthenon also produced a social order, in which most of the work was done by people who were legally proper, in which women managed essential domestic economies, while remaining politically invisible, and in which the freedom celebrated in philosophy and oratory was built on the unfreedom of the majority.
Then let us begin with the ordinary citizen, the man who had the rights, but not always the means to use them.
The free citizen of modest means woke before dawn. His day was organized around the need to work. Athens had no permanent welfare system and no guaranteed income. Economic security depended on physical capacity, access to tools or materials, demand for services, and the absence of illness or injury. A potter, a leather worker, a farmer, or a small trader lived close to the margin. A season of bad harvests, a period of illness, or the disruption of warfare could tip a family from subsistence into crisis. Manual labor carried a social stigma in Athenian culture that coexisted uneasily with the fact that most citizens performed it. Elite writers described craftsmen and traders as having souls deformed by their work, as people whose occupations prevented them from developing the virtues of a full citizen. Yet these were the people who built the ships, made the weapons, threw the pots, and produced the goods on which Athenian life depended.
So the culture that celebrated citizenship also denigrated the labor that made citizenship possible.
Yes. And here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard image of Athens. The celebrated Athenian citizen is typically imagined as someone with time to debate, to attend the assembly, to watch tragedies at the theatre of Dionysus. Most citizens did not have this kind of time in any regular sense. Attending the assembly meant a day without income. Jury service paid a small fee introduced, precisely because many citizens could not otherwise afford to participate. Democracy in Athens required institutional support to be accessible even to the citizen class it nominally included. The ordinary citizen was also a soldier. Athens relied on citizen infantry, the hoplites, whose service was organized around the ownership of sufficient property to purchase their own armor and weapons. A citizen below the hoplite property threshold served as a rower in the navy, which was equally demanding and considerably less prestigious. Military service could be called at any time, could last for months or years, and was conducted at the individual's own expense for equipment, if not for basic provisions. War was not an abstraction for the Athenian male citizen. It was a recurring interruption to every other aspect of his life. The agora, the central public space of Athens, combined marketplace, civic center, and site of informal intellectual exchange. Merchants displayed goods, legal proceedings were conducted, politicians sought support, philosophers argued. The agora was the physical expression of the Athenian idea that public life and private life were intertwined. But access to its full range of activities was not equal. Women who appeared there were typically engaged in economic transactions rather than civic participation. Enslaved people moved through it on errands. Metics could trade there but not vote or hold office.
So the agora was simultaneously open to all, and structured to benefit some far more than others.
Yes, the elite citizen inhabited a different Athens. Wealth meant freedom from manual labor, which meant time for exercise in the gymnasium, time for philosophical conversation, time for the symposium, the wine-drinking gathering that served as the primary social institution of the educated male elite. The symposium was not simply a party, it was a structured event for the exchange of ideas, poetry, music, and political discussion among men of similar status. It was the institution through which elite culture reproduced itself. The wealth that enabled this lifestyle came from multiple sources. Agricultural land worked by tenants or enslaved laborers, silver mines at Lorient worked almost entirely by enslaved people under conditions of extreme brutality, maritime trade, and the inheritance of property through family lines. Elite Athenians did not typically engage in trade themselves, which was considered beneath their dignity, but they often financed trading ventures through silent partnerships. The leisure celebrated in philosophical texts was funded by arrangements whose human cost was rarely discussed in those same texts.
So the leisure that produced the philosophy was itself produced by labor that the philosophy rarely acknowledged.
Yes, the enslaved population of Athens was its largest dependent group. Estimates suggest that enslaved people may have constituted between a third and a half of the total population of Attica, though precise numbers are impossible to establish. They came from across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea region, acquired through warfare, piracy, purchase, and birth to enslaved mothers. Under Athenian law, they had no legal identity. They could not own property, could not marry legally, could not testify in court except under torture, and had no right to resist the will of their owner chose. The conditions of their labor varied significantly depending on their owner and their function. Household enslaved people in wealthy families might live in relative physical comfort, though without autonomy or security. Those who worked in craft workshops might develop skilled trades and even earn small sums through arrangements that allowed them to keep a portion of their income. Those at the Lorient silver mines worked in conditions of extreme physical hardship, underground in narrow shafts often chained with high mortality rates. The category of enslavement covered an enormous range of experience, but the absence of freedom was constant across all of its
The enslavement in Athens was not a uniform condition, but a legal status that could encompass vastly different material realities.
Yes, manumission, the formal freeing of an enslaved person, did occur in Athens more commonly than in some other ancient societies, but it required the owner's consent, typically involved payment by the freed person, and even after manumission the freed person remained bound by obligations to their former owner. Full legal equality was not the outcome of manumission. The freed person became a metic, a foreign resident with the right to live and work in Athens but without the political rights of a citizen. The lives of women in classical Athens were defined by a combination of essential responsibility and political invisibility. The citizen woman managed the household, an institution of real economic complexity in a society without modern market services. She oversaw food production, textile manufacture, the supervision of enslaved domestic workers, the raising of children, and the management of the family's resources when the male head of household was absent, which, given military service, could be for extended periods.
So women ran complex economic institutions, while being legally and politically invisible.
Yes, the ideal expressed in elite Athenian sources was that respectable women should be neither seen nor heard outside the home. The reality was more varied. Poor women worked in markets, at wells, and in fields because their households required it. Elite women supervised large domestic operations and could exercise significant informal influence. But the ideological framing was consistent. The proper place for the citizen woman was interior, domestic, and invisible to public life. The physical city of Athens was organized around a series of overlapping spaces that carried distinct social meanings. The Acropolis, with its temples and monuments, was a religious space visible to everyone but accessible primarily for ritual purposes. The Pnyx, the hillside where the assembly met, was a civic space in which the formal political life of the citizen class was enacted. The gymnasium was an elite space for physical training and intellectual exchange that excluded women, enslaved people, and those without the leisure to attend. The deme, the local neighborhood unit, was where most citizens actually encountered the institutions of civic life in their daily experience.
So the city was a layered system of spaces, each accessible to different groups for different purposes.
Yes, religious festivals were one of the few occasions when the full population of the city appeared in shared public space. The festival of the Panathenea, held annually, and in greater form every 4 years, involved processions that included citizens, metics, and even some enslaved people in subsidiary roles. The theatre of Dionysus, where the great tragedies and comedies were performed, was attended by citizens and possibly by some others, though the question of who exactly attended remains debated among scholars. These festival occasions created a temporary experience of collective identity that the social structure otherwise worked against. The relationship between Athens and its subject allies in the Delian League deserves mention as another dimension of the city's inequality. Athens transformed what had been a voluntary military alliance against Persia into an effective empire, compelling allied cities to pay tribute, moving the alliance treasury to Athens, and using those funds to build the Parthenon and other monuments. The cultural achievements of the Periclean age were funded in part by the tribute of cities that had entered a defensive alliance, and found themselves contributing to Athenian imperial grandeur.
So even the celebrated monuments of Athenian culture were built with resources extracted from others through the exercise of power.
Yes, the Parthenon was built on tribute money in a period when Athens was suppressing allied revolts with military force. Thucydides, the Athenian historian, recorded the famous Melian dialogue in which Athenian representatives told the people of Melos that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. This was not the philosophy of barbarians. It was the foreign policy of the same city that was producing Sophocles and Socrates. Education in Athens was another mechanism of social reproduction that reinforced existing divisions. Elite boys received extensive education in music, gymnastics, and letters, preparing them for participation in civic and cultural life. Boys of modest means might receive some basic literacy instruction but would enter trades or crafts early. Girls of any class received domestic education centered on the skills needed to manage a household. Enslaved children received no formal education, except what was useful for their function.
So education was not a path out of the social structure, but a mechanism for reproducing it.
Yes, the figure of Socrates is instructive here. He came from a family of modest means. His father was a stonemason, and he himself worked at some point as a craftsman. His philosophical activity was conducted in public spaces rather than in the private setting of the elite symposium. He spoke to anyone who would engage with him, including craftsmen, young men of wealthy families, and visitors to the city. His trial and execution were in part a response to his refusal to respect the social boundaries that Athenian culture maintained, including the boundary between the intellectual discussions appropriate to the elite and the public questioning he extended to everyone.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand classical Athenian life across its full social range, rather than through its most celebrated figures, where would you invite them to continue with?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Daily Life in Ancient Greece by Robert Garland.
So this is a book that examines the full social range of ancient Greek society rather than focusing exclusively on its most celebrated aspects.
Garland provides a detailed and accessible exploration of how people lived in classical Greek society, examining social structure, work, family life, and cultural practices. The book offers a nuanced understanding of everyday experiences beyond myths and heroic narratives, highlighting the contrasts between different social groups and providing valuable insight into the realities of ancient life.
Is it accessible to readers without a background in ancient history?
Garland writes with genuine clarity and without assuming prior knowledge. The book is organized thematically rather than chronologically, which makes it easy to read selectively. A reader interested specifically in the lives of women, or in the conditions of enslaved people, or in the economy of the household, can find those chapters without having to read everything else first.
So it gives the reader the texture of ancient life, rather than a narrative of events.
Precisely. And Garland is careful not to romanticize. The book is honest about the inequalities and the hardships of ancient life, while also giving appropriate recognition to the genuine cultural achievements of the period. That balance is what makes it valuable.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
Athenian democracy, taken on its own terms, was a genuine and in many ways extraordinary political experiment. The assembly was open to all adult male citizens who voted directly on legislation, war, and foreign policy without representation or delegation. Magistrates were chosen by lot rather than election, on principle that the lottery was more democratic than selection, which always tended to favor wealth, eloquence, and social connection. Pay was introduced for jury service, and eventually for assembly attendance to enable poorer citizens to participate. But the system's exclusions were structural and deliberate. Women were excluded not through oversight but through the explicit definition of political life as a male domain. Enslaved people were excluded by definition as property rather than persons. Metics who might have lived in Athens for generations, paid taxes, and served in the military, were excluded from political participation, regardless of their contribution. The democracy of Athens was a democracy of insiders in a city, whose functioning depended on the labor of outsiders.
So the democracy was not an imperfect version of modern democracy. It was a different kind of institution with different premises about who mattered politically.
Yes, modern democracy is representative rather than direct, and has progressively extended its franchise through centuries of struggle until it includes, in principle, all adult citizens regardless of sex, class, or origin. The Athenian model was direct but drastically restricted in its inclusion. The comparison is instructive in both directions. Athenian directness offers something that representation has difficulty replicating, while modern inclusion addresses something that Athenian practiced systematically. Denied. Food in classical Athens reflected and reinforced social divisions. The basic diet of most Athenians was simple: barley or wheat bread, olives, figs, legumes, and occasionally fish. Meat was expensive and rarely consumed except at religious festivals where the sacrifice provided occasion for communal eating. The elite diet included more varied protein, more wine of higher quality, and greater variety in general. The symposium menu, described in various texts, was a world apart from the daily rations of the craftsman, or the enslaved agricultural worker.
So even the most basic material of life, food, expressed the social hierarchy?
Yes. Housing followed the same pattern. Elite houses had interior courtyards, separate rooms for different functions, and space for the supervision of enslaved domestic workers. The houses of poor citizens were smaller, darker, and shared more functions in fewer rooms. The houses of enslaved people, when they had any separate space at all, were the minimal accommodations provided by their. Athens was a city of extreme physical proximity, in which social distance was maintained through a complex system of spatial, legal, and ritual separation. The metics, the foreign residents, occupied an interesting intermediate position. Many were skilled craftsmen, traders, or professionals who had come to Athens precisely because its commercial activity offered opportunities not available in their home cities. They could own property, operate businesses, and participate in religious life. They paid a special tax that marked their non-citizen status. Some achieved significant wealth and social prominence. None achieved political rights regardless of how long they had lived in Athens, or how much they had contributed to its economy.
So Athens attracted people with skills and capital, and then excluded them permanently from the political community they were helping to sustain.
Yes, the modern relevance of this picture is not simply as a contrast to our own more inclusive arrangements. It is as a reminder that celebrated cultures can coexist with, and indeed depend upon, systematic exclusion. The marble and the philosophy and the democratic institutions were real achievements. So were the mines at Laurion, the confinement of women, and the legal invisibility of the metic. All of these were features of the same city at the same time. The question Athens poses to the present is not whether we have exceeded its injustices, but whether we have found the ones we are still not seeing.
Athens is a mirror that reflects not only the past, but the shape of the blind spots we may still carry.
Yes, every society tells itself a story about its highest achievement, and in doing so risks making that story the whole story. Athens told a story about democracy, reason, and the examined life. The full story included the people who did not appear in that narrative, whose labor made the narrative possible, and whose exclusion the narrative never adequately acknowledged. History's task is to restore them, not to cancel the achievements, but to complete the picture.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the potter's early morning, all of them while hearing only some of their voices.
Athens reminds us that the distance between a civilization's ideals and its practice is always worth measuring, because the gap is where most people actually lived.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.